Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
So today I'm going to give a short introduction or a talk on an interesting topic that I've been researching recently, which is proofs for God's existence that Muslim scholars have used throughout history. I did a talk about it, I think a few months ago, and I didn't get to go into a lot of detail about one of the main ones that they used. I used like one of the introductory ones. This is one of the main ones that they use and one of the most popular ones that they use. So I'm pretty sure many of us have heard of William Lane Craig, right? Mm-hmm. And his argument that he uses called the Kalam cosmological argument, which is made up of 3 points. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, right? 2 premises, 1 conclusion. It's pretty straightforward and simple. Now, he got this from Muslim scholars, specifically the scholar Imam al-Ghazali, may Allah be pleased with him. This is an argument that he used, and it was a formulation of a previous argument that was used by Muslim scholars. And this argument is called Burhan Huduth al-Ajsam, which means the argument from the origination of bodies. I know that's a little bit much, but this is the argument. So to give a bit of background, or the name of the argument, to give a bit of background as to what it is, where it came from, why they used it. Muslim scholars, or Muslims in general, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, when they started expanding and going to different parts of the world and giving dawah, they eventually came across, the Greek civilizations and their texts and their works, especially their works in philosophy and science and these type of things. And so this led to them translating these books, translating these works of Aristotle, Plato, and all these people, and it led to a division. Some Muslims, they took what Aristotle and all these people said wholesale, completely, right? So for example, one of the things that Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, believed is that the universe is eternal. It's never had a beginning. It's always been here, always will be. Even though Aristotle believed in some type of God, in a way, some type of creator, this creator has been eternally creating the world. That's what he believed. And some Muslims took this wholesale and twisted the Quran and the Hadith to support this belief. I don't know how you can do that when Allah says He's Badi'u samawati wal ard. Badi' means the one who made something new, meaning it wasn't there and then it was there. So that means that Allah created the universe when it was not there. But they had to twist the Quran to fit this narrative because they had a bit of an inferiority complex towards the Greeks. They thought that the Greeks were very intelligent people, and they were for their time, but they were looking at them as if they were this very powerful, very intelligent, advanced civilization that they could only hope to aspire to be like. So they took their ideas wholesale. One of the people who did this is a man named Ibn Sina, who was very famous. He's called Avicenna in the European tradition. And he had this belief that Allah created the world eternally, right? So there was that camp. Then there was another camp of people. They took what the Greeks, some of what the Greeks believed. So for example, it's not necessarily what they believed, but it was a system that they had of logic, or in Arabic it's called mantiq, right? Their way of logically structuring arguments, like premise 1, premise 2, conclusion, that's a Greek type of thing, right? Or the idea, some of the ideas about properties and how things in the universe work, which I'm going to get into in a second, which they used in this argument, right? So some of them, they took some things and left other things because those things either didn't align with the Quran and the Sunnah, or they didn't align with logic, right? They were just wrong, they were false. So these people who did that, the people who did that, they decided to engage with the first camp. They are called the Muslim philosophers, the people who believed everything the philosophers said. The Muslim scholars learned what the Greeks said, translated it, and used it to refute the Muslim philosophers. So that's originally who this argument was made against. But now people are using this argument against atheists because it's kind of a similar issue, right? So what is this argument? So in order to understand this argument, you have to understand a few terms and ideas. So one, I don't think I have to write, I can just say it, is huduth. What does huduth mean? Huduth is the opposite of qidam. Huduth means something had a beginning, or that it existed after not existing before. Qidam, or something being qadim, that means that something has always been there. and it never will end. So they were arguing for huduth al-alam, which means the beginningness, I guess you could say, of the universe, right? Whereas the Muslim philosophers, they were arguing that the universe has always been here. And this is what even some atheists say, despite the Big Bang being basically proven, or at least heavily proven, right? They'll say that, okay, maybe there's a universe before this one, for example, and that it just compressed and then it exploded again, and now it's our universe, right? So they were trying to prove the truth of the universe, right? That the universe had a beginning. So how did they do this? They broke the universe down. Everything in the universe, they tried to find what everything in the universe has in common. From us, to planets, to stars, to literally anything you can think of. And they wanted to take that and use that to prove that the universe had a beginning. So what did they do? They broke the universe down into a few basic categories. So one is a body, jism. Like it says, وَحَانْ حُدُوث الْأَجْسَامِ. Ajsam is a plural of jism, and jism means a body. Now that doesn't mean necessarily like my body, your body, etc. A jism in the Arabic language and in this field, and even in philosophy at the time, it means anything with spatial extension. So what does that mean? That sounds like really complicated. Basically anything with a length, a width, and a height. If it has those things, it's a body, right? Anything in the universe you see has that, because everything is in 3 dimensions, right? Everything we see is 3 dimensions. So it has a length, a width, and a height, no matter what it is. So us, an animal, a tree, the stars, the universe, all of those are bodies. That's what they mean by body when they say that bodies are originated. They don't mean human bodies or animal bodies. They mean anything that has 3 dimensions. That is a body. So then they said, okay, they're bodies, and then there are properties, right? So for example, me, I exist. I'm a body, right? I have a body. But I also have properties. I have a height, right? I have a skin color, right? I have a certain amount of fingers. I have certain body parts, etc. These are my properties that I have. Some of these properties are essential properties, and others are accidental. Okay, what does that mean? These terms are really complicated, but I'll try to break it down. You know, I'm a normal person just like you guys. I'm not like into all this philosophy stuff. But to put it simply, an essential property is something that makes something what it is. So take, for example, I'm really bad at drawing, but bear with me. A triangle, right? An essential property of a triangle is that it has 3 corners. Because if it had 4 corners, it wouldn't be a triangle, right? So an essential property is something that something needs to make it what it is. If it doesn't have it, it's not that thing anymore. Me as a human, if I don't have human nature or human qualities, I'm not human anymore, am I? Right? So that's essential. Y'all can stop me if anything I'm saying is okay. You know? Okay, good. So the second is accidental. That doesn't mean like car accident. It means something that it doesn't need, a quality that it has, but if it changed, it doesn't change what it is. So this triangle, it could be red, it could be blue, it could be white, but it's still a triangle, right? So color would be an example of an accidental property. Basically, any property that can change. Any changing property, that's accidental. And they used this specific type of property to prove that bodies, or anything that we see in the universe, anything physical, I'll just put it like that. Anything physical has an origin, right? Because anything that's physical has properties that can change. And they use an example in the Quran, I believe it's in Surah 6, where Ibrahim alayhi salam, he's looking at the stars and the moon and the sun, and he sees that they disappear, they set, and he says, Ma ahibbul afilin, or la ahibbul afilin, if I said the ayah right, which means he does not like those that set or those that move, right? Now, the scholars of tafsir and the scholars of theology, they looked at this verse, or these verses, and they were pondering over it, like, what does this mean? Like, some of them said that Ibrahim alayhi salam, he's saying that he doesn't like things that, or he doesn't worship things that their presence is not always there. And Allah's presence is always there in His knowledge and in His power, right? That's one interpretation. The other was to say that this is a proof for this argument that they're using. Because what they're essentially saying is that if anything changes, it's not God, right? And the sun and the moon and the stars change, and therefore they're God. So how do they go about proving that things that change, which are physical objects, they have to have an origin. They have to have a beginning. There's several ways that they did this. Some of them are more complicated than others, but I'm going to use the basic one that pretty much everyone kind of has heard if they've heard of arguments for God's existence. And it's an argument from what's called an infinite regress. So first we have to understand what infinity is, right? And infinity, in Arabic, they say, La bidaya wa la nihaya, which means it has no beginning and no end, right? It's more of a concept than it is a number. We think of it as a number, right? But we'll say things like, oh, times 100, times infinity, right? Infinity is not an actual number. It's just a concept. It's just the idea that any number you give, no matter how big it is, no matter how small it is, you could add 1 to it, no matter what it is. There are potentially, it's called a potential infinite, a potentially infinite amount of numbers. No number you can give is too big to where you cannot add 1 to it. That's all infinity or the concept means. An actual infinity would be an actual infinite amount of things in the real world, right? Which people debate whether that's possible or not. The Muslim scholars said that's impossible, but I want to specifically talk about infinity in terms of things changing for infinity, because this gets into what time is, and time essentially is the measurement of change, or the measurement of things moving, changing, going from one state to another. Now, if the universe has always been here, right, then that means time has always been here, right? And that things have constantly been changing forever. Now, what the Muslim scholars are trying to prove is that if something is physical, it has length, width, and height, and it can change, which all things that are physical can change, then it cannot exist for an infinite amount of time in the past. Why? So let's say there's a ball. I'll make it very simple. There's a ball, and it's been moving for eternity, from eternity past, right? It has no beginning. Now let's say that ball has been moving for infinity, and it's here now, in front of me. Now, that for that ball to be here in front of me after moving for infinity, that would mean that an infinite series of movements or moments came to an end at this current moment. Now, can infinity come to an end? It can't. By definition, infinity cannot come to an end. This is called an argument from contradiction. You're saying that a thing that cannot end, a never-ending series, ended at this current moment. The ball would have to have gone through an infinite series of motion in order to get here at this current moment, which is impossible. That means that that ball, because again, motion is one of those properties, actually one of the properties that I was talking about, properties that can change, properties that don't make a thing what it is, right? That's one of them, because something's position in space, like my position in space, right? It's a property of mine that can change, right? I can be here, I can be there. So all physical objects have changing properties. Why? Because all physical objects are in space. And anything that's in space can move or can be at rest. You see what I'm saying? Because it's in space. So it can move or it can be at rest. So since it can move and since it can be at rest, that means that since motion cannot be infinite, it cannot be infinite into the past, it has to have a beginning. Does that make sense? So what they were saying is that you can't say that anything in the universe had a beginning, let alone the universe in and of itself. Everything in the universe that you see is a body, right? Or it's a property of a body. If it's a body and it has properties that can change, it cannot change infinitely into the past. It must have a beginning. Because if it changes, then it has to get to its current state now, either through infinite changes or finite changes. Infinite changes, that's impossible. It cannot get to the current moment if it was infinite. So there has to be finite. That's essentially what they were saying. Does that make sense? Anything you want me to explain? Or because it sounds a bit complicated, but when you think about it, it's very intuitive. Anything that changes, it has to have a beginning to get to its current state. And so they use this argument, like I said, mainly against people who believe that the universe was eternal. They still believed in God, but they believed that God had to create the universe and that he couldn't choose not to, essentially.
How did they explain how Allah created something that is eternal?
The Muslim philosophers?
Yes.
Again, this is, it's because, like I said, they are taking in Greek philosophy, right? The way they explain it is that since God has to exist, and he can't fail to exist, then everything he does has to be that way. It kind of goes into a thing called modal logic. Basically, if something is necessary, meaning that it has to be that way, contingent, meaning it could be another way, or impossible. So if God has to exist, then whatever he creates also has to exist. That's kind of their logic, which negates the will and the choice of God.
I understand that. But for eternity, in my mind, eternity goes both ways. Right? So if Allah, when he creates something, it had a beginning.
Exactly. That's our common sense notion of what creation is, and it's correct. That's what the Muslim scholars were trying to say. They were trying to say our idea of what creation is, meaning that something had a beginning and that something created it at that point in time. That's true. The Muslim philosophers were saying no, that's not always the case.
How is that? But I understand what you're saying. I'm trying to figure out what is their response to that. Because anytime I have an idea, I try to think, what is somebody opposite of me saying that makes sense? How can they say Allah created everything, but if he created it, he created the universe, but the universe is eternal, that means he didn't create it, the universe is with him the whole time.
Yeah, so this is how they'll respond, right? They'll say, it's something called emanation. So they say, think of like the sun and its rays. So imagine the sun was there for eternity. The sun can't be there for eternity, we proved that. But let's say the sun was there for eternity. Since the sun has to produce rays, right? The sun being there for eternity means that the rays are there for eternity. That's what they're saying. And the main problem with that is, one, it flies in the face of our common sense notion of what creating something or causing something or making something is, right? And number two, it goes against the Quran directly. The Quran directly says that Allah is Badi'u samawati wal ard, which means he's the originator, meaning that it had a beginning. The universe had a beginning, and Allah is the one who began it.
So what are the scholars trying to say? What are they trying to convince us of?
They're trying to convince you.
This argument.
They're trying to convince you that everything that you see has a beginning, no matter what it is. Even things you have not seen in the universe, it has a beginning for sure. If it is a body, if it's in space and time, it has a beginning. Even no matter what, if you've seen it or not, it has a beginning. So if everything in the universe has a beginning, that means there's a point where there was nothing. So if there was nothing, then that means that God chose to create the universe, and that it has a beginning. That was their main point, because their main concern was that what these philosophers were doing is negating God's will and choice. His ikhtiyar is called in Arabic, or his irada. They're saying that God had to create the universe as a necessary byproduct of his existence. The same way the sun has to produce rays. Like he had no choice. When in the Quran, it says that God has choice. He could have done something, but he chose something else. Allah could have not created the universe, but he chose to create it. Right? So that's the main thing that the Muslim scholars were trying to prove. One, that the universe had a beginning, and two, that God has will. Those are the two main things.
It's interesting they would even engage this, because the people of the book did this for hundreds of years, and it kind of took them off course.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's interesting that Muslim scholars would even engage something like that when we know that Allah is the creator of bodies, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems that they would be doing what others have done, and they've seen the results. So if we see the results, you think you can do better?
Right. Yeah, like I said, it was two camps. The Muslim scholars were the ones who refuted that idea that the universe is eternal. It's the Muslim philosophers, people who, I don't want to call them Muslim philosophers, it sounds like I'm giving them legitimacy. They were Muslim, yes, but they have a wrong idea because they were engrossed in philosophy, right? The philosophers were the ones who were saying that the universe was eternal. It didn't have a beginning. The Muslim scholars were like, okay, we're going to translate these texts that you guys love so much. We're going to learn it. We're going to deep dive into it, and we're going to use it to refute you, which is exactly what they did. All these terms like, okay, a body, accidental property, these are all philosophical Greek terms, by the way. They're like, okay, that makes sense. Okay, something has property, something is a body, okay. Well, based on your argument, and based on your logic, and based on your own terms, you're wrong. The universe had a beginning, actually. Based on your own terms.
I see what you're saying, because my first inclination is to not entertain it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we live in a world right now where people believe in completely false, made-up stuff, and you have to refute it because it starts growing so large. These are Muslims, one Muslim group and another Muslim group, and then one of them says something that is outlandish, like Allah has no will or the universe always existed. The first inclination is, that's too stupid for me to argue, but then they started getting people listening to it. And seemingly that's what happened, is when you have a group of people that you have to then address it.
Well, yeah, it's going to be around for a while, but that's an old argument.
Right.
It started back with during Imam Ghazali's time, I believe, and certain elements will keep it alive, but the average person, they're asking, okay, so how do I benefit from that?
Right.
I can't even understand my own creation, my own existence. You tell me now I'm engaged in this. That's the average person going to say. I had a brother in the Arabic class asking me, well, okay, I was explaining to him how there's so many connections in the Quran and in the life of Muhammad, present upon him, pertaining to the number 5. First 5 ayats, 5 daily prayers, 5, and that you have 5. And the question came up, well, how can I benefit from that kind of stuff? And I'm saying, dude, I didn't tell him this. I'm saying, I'm just showing you how these numbers, we're not into numerology, but the number itself is dispersed throughout the religion. First was the 5 ayat, verses that the Prophet received, and then the Buni al-Islam, the 5 essentials, and on and on and on and on and on. You can't see how to use that. I don't know what to say. I'm just pointing that out, because people will ask that question, especially if they get into dialectics. They would ask that, how would I benefit? How can I use this to benefit me?
Right. I agree that the average person probably was not affected by it, but it did spread. That's why Muslim scholars were talking about it, because it did spread to people, right? People were walking around thinking that God doesn't have will, God can't choose, God had to create the universe. And so even though, because Muslim scholars, their main concern back then was the salvation of the people that they're teaching and that they're speaking to. So if they see that this idea is going around that God doesn't have will, or that the universe is eternal, and they're seeing ignorant Muslims, with all due respect, fall into that, they feel obliged to respond to it. Not only that, it's because the arguments that those philosophers used were convincing to people. Because again, if you think about it, I find it very interesting. They looked at the Greek philosophers as like their heroes, as if they were these people that they should look up to with high esteem. And that's not to diminish those people. They were intelligent for their time, of course, but they had basically an inferiority complex towards them. They looked at them, which is interesting, Muslims looking at the West, and because the Greek was like Greece was like a Western civilization. Muslims looking at the West and looking at how great they were and stuff. Kind of, feel like that's kind of going on today still. People looking at the West as if the West is the pinnacle of civilization. But anyways, that's a tangent. They looked at these people as if they were intelligent and they could say no wrong. Everything they said was like wahi, it was like revelation. It was like the truth. Muslim scholars who knew the Quran, who knew the Sunnah, and who were intelligent as well. That's another thing I want to highlight here, is that Muslim scholars, people think of Muslims, or even religious people in general, as people who are backwards. They don't want to think. They don't want to logically consider things, right? But Muslim scholars were directly engaging in philosophy, in logic, in dialectics, in arguments, all these things, right? And they taught this throughout the Muslim world, like all these arguments, all these points, how to think logically, how to think critically. They, as a matter of fact, they had a saying that is awwal wajib an-nadr, if I'm saying that correctly, which is the first obligation upon a mukallaf, which means anyone who has taklif, anyone who is responsible, meaning once you hit the age of puberty and you're an adult, and Allah holds you accountable for your deeds. The first obligation is nadr, which means to reflect and to contemplate. What they were saying is that the first obligation on any person, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, is to critically think and to understand why you believe in God, or come to the conclusion that a God exists. They said that you can't believe in God based on what's called taqlid, right? Meaning you're just blind following people, your family, your friends. That if you believe in God just because of that, they said you're just because of that, because of your surroundings, they say that your iman is not complete fully. Because you don't really know why you believe in God. You're just doing it, just because. So that's another aspect I want to highlight. But yeah, I kind of got lost in what I was saying. But yeah, the main thing is that these ideas were spreading because Muslims felt some type of inferiority towards the Greeks. So what the Muslim scholars were doing was they were saying, look, these Greek people, they were very intelligent people, but Allah is more intelligent than these people. And not only that, we can show how flawed these people are by using their terms and their ideas and using it against them to refute them, which is exactly what Burhan Hudud al-Ajsam, the proof from the origination of bodies, was doing. It used the principles that things have properties that can change, which is a Greek. So it's not their idea, but they formalized it. Everyone knows that things change, but they put it in like a format, right? They use that idea, they use those terms, and then they use the concept of infinity, right? To prove that everything that exists in the universe has a beginning. And that these Greek people, even though they were intelligent, they had a blind spot, right? And that they were not perfect. And that what we have is the absolute truth. Now, like I said, I find it interesting that this argument was used against philosophers mainly, Muslim philosophers, people who believed in God. But this argument now is being used against people, for people who don't believe in God, atheists, right? It just shows that what's the word I want to use? How versatile, I guess, this argument is, and how powerful it is. That it's been around for basically like more than 1,000 years, right? And it's still being used to this day, even though if I'm being honest, I think that William Lane Craig, from my looking at it, he kind of butchered the argument a little bit, just a little bit, if I'm being honest.
I would classify him as an Orientalist. A lot of Orientalists, they didn't get it right.
Yeah.
But to go back to why the Muslims would follow the trend of saying that the Greeks put forth these ideas when the Greeks were taught by the Egyptians.
Right.
And it's even a lot of the things that we have today, they give the Greeks the credit. I can understand European giving the Greeks the credit. Why would the Muslims give the Greeks the credit? And they're right there in the back door of the Egyptians who came up with the first mistress system, and they had Muslim scholars as well. And they taught the Greeks. The Greeks had to come to them to get education. But you go over them and say that the Greeks gave this idea to them. I don't get it. That's just me.
Again, it comes down to inferiority complex. That's the reason why a lot of people do what they do, unfortunately. Or they look at civilizations and try to emulate them. As a matter of fact, I think there's a hadith, I'm going to butcher it, but the basic story is that it talks about how shirk and polytheism got into the Arabian Peninsula. And it was one particular person, he heard about different civilizations, right? Like that were around the Arabian Peninsula. And he heard about how powerful they were and how strong they were. And he chalked that up to them worshiping other gods. He said the reason they're so amazing and so powerful and why they're so much better than the Arabs is because they worship other gods. So we should do that. So we're going to worship Allah and we're going to worship other gods too. An inferiority complex, essentially. He tries to imitate people who he thinks are better. They're better than him, essentially. And by doing that, it came to his detriment, essentially. So history repeats itself, unfortunately.
But to add to what Brother Aaron was saying, the Greek philosophers got their Greek mythology from Egyptians, and the Romans got their Roman mythology from the Greeks. All of it came from Egypt. The Indian mythology came from Egypt. The Celtic mythology, all of this originated in Kemet or Egypt. But the credit is given to all of them. We go to the movies and see Thor and Odin, and they make $1 billion off those movies. But if it was said it was Egypt with black and brown people, nobody would probably go see that movie. When they made the movies about Moses and they had Christian Bale or whoever it was, some white guy playing Moses, people love to see those things. But also, during the time of the prophet, people believed that the universe was eternal. When he is saying that Allah created the universe, he was saying something contrary to the popular belief, because Greeks were also saying this at that time as well. What he was saying was, this is the truth. That's why it's so great to to understand the Quran, but also to understand the civilization, the world around it. Because we say all the time, Allah creates the heavens and the earth, but we don't realize He's saying, what you believe is wrong. This is right. You understand? Like, almost everything He's saying is correcting. That's why I said Allah taught men by the pen what they did not know. Y'all thought this was the universe was forever, or the universe existed forever. It did not. I created it. Right? Is what Allah is saying over and over again. Also, the Muslim philosophers and the Muslim scholars that you were talking about, and their understanding of the universe, the reason why that is important, especially once it starts growing, is because once you get Allah wrong, you can get anything else wrong. Mm-hmm. Right? That's why shirk is so important. It reminded me of after Jesus, they had all these council meetings. They're saying, no, I think Jesus is God. Oh, I think the Holy Spirit is God. No, they're not God at all. And then they voted, and the Jesus people saying He was God won. So that's why it's important to argue these points and don't just let it go because you think this is a silly argument. It is silly, right? But to people who don't know, it sounds excellent. It sounds like a great point, and then it can grow, and that's what happened. Paul's movement grew bigger than the Tawheed that Jesus taught, and it took the whole thing over. And now we have the Trinity. So it's really, I always say that Christianity and Judaism are case studies for Muslims, because you can see how they went off completely, how they went off the rails, and that those Muslim scholars took that as important and said, we got to stop this. We got to nip this in the bud because this is going to be some foolishness. People are going to be believing 1,000 years from now. Luckily, the Muslims didn't, by and large, but then atheists. Atheism also didn't exist. It's a very recent thing. People believing that God doesn't exist is some foolishness. I don't care if people listen or not. And then they use some other foolishness to justify it. So,
we were given a challenge. We were given a challenge that said, if you think that the universe has an end to it, then just ask yourself the question, once you get to the end, then what's on the other side? And nobody could answer. Scientists couldn't even answer. They couldn't even come up with a map of the universe. And maybe they should show you how to get to Mars, Jupiter, Pluto, that 12 bodies. But beyond that, which even Neil deGrasse Tyson had admitted how things are still expanding out there. So how are you gonna get to something that you don't even know how to get to? It's just so that's like a never-ending conversation. It's really vast.
That reminds me of another thing I forgot to mention. Talking about the universe ending, that's another principle that they had. Anything that ends has a beginning. If it ends, it has to have a beginning. Because again, it's the whole concept of infinity, right? If something is infinite, it cannot end by definition. It cannot. If you say that something is infinite and has an end, you're saying a never-ending thing has an end.
What a contradiction.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So if it ends, it has to have a beginning. That was another point they made. They use the concept of infinity to, they use several different examples I could use. But not only that something can't be infinite in time or infinitely change, but there can't be an actually infinite number of real things. That cannot happen. Some people say that. I'm not trying to get into all that because that's a very complicated discussion. But definitely I agree. There could not be infinite time into the past. Infinite into the future is different, right? Because it has a starting point, it has a foundation. Mm-hmm. But if it's infinite into the past, there is no foundation. So how can it end at that point? How can it come to an end? Or how have a current now point?
Oh, and also, when we also do our own study of the two terms, Wahid and Ahad, we see vast oceans of differences. One that just cannot be defined, Ahad. That's why I said like that, Kul Huwallahu Ahad. Nothing is to be compared to him. You can't even come up with a likeness first to move beyond that. Mm-hmm. But in Wahid, you may use it all the time for counting. So you might get way out there where you just can't stop going. But that's not like Ahad.
Yes.
So, without the contemplation of these things, you'll never see that one is like really, really, really out there. The other one is big, but it's still pale compared to Ahad.
what you were saying about the ending of the universe, I know scientists had also been looking at matter and whether matter had a beginning or ending, and they were saying it had an ending because proteins in atoms, decay.
Mm-hmm.
So it would suggest that ultimately, even the the subatomic particles of atoms decay. So they have an ending, which means they had a beginning. Also, scientists now, like you said, the Big Bang Theory, despite the string theory, they all or universally, or not unanimously, but universally accept that there was nothing, no time, space, or weight before the Big Bang. There was nothingness, and then it came into existence, which is what William Lane Craig uses all the time.
Exactly.
If it comes into existence, it had to have a creator, which is, to me, I think that's very simplistic for the anybody that's thinking about it. The analogy that they use is a child asks somebody, well, what happened right before that? What happened right, whatever it is. If we talk about right now, all the way to the beginning, what happened right before that? And then you realize that it is futile to try to erase Allah, to erase God from that conversation.
That's one frustrating thing, is that the Big Bang Theory is pretty widely accepted, but even if you argue with the atheist on that basis, they'll be like, oh, well, it could change, it could be wrong, or oh, there could have been a universe before ours. Mm-hmm. Okay, so how is there a universe if before the Big Bang there was no time and space? Like, how does that even work? But okay, that's why I prefer to use this, because this is more, it's using more of like a rational idea that you can't really refute, which is that it just can't be infinite. It cannot be infinitely long. Like, it can't be.
You can refute it. Not that you can refute it, but they will. You know what I mean?
They'll try, yeah.
That's what I'm saying with saying what happened before that. Even despite the fact that they argue it, you know what kind of person you're talking to now. So
yeah.
They ultimately are acknowledging that he's defeated me, so I'm gonna say some foolishness.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So then that is where that line between the believer and the kufr is. You know what I'm saying is true, so you just said something foolish to get out of this. Right now, I can't say for sure you know, but it seems like you know. I'll leave it at that. If we get all the way to that point, and you say, well, I think there's a universe before then, even though there's no time and space, then you don't want to accept it, and I can't make you accept it.
Right. Yeah, I think like that.
Definitely, absolutely.
Yeah, one thing I've come to terms with is that
You ain't coming to terms with it. But go ahead and say it.
I'm trying to come to terms with, how about that?
Thank you.
Is that for some people, or a lot of people in the world, they prefer their preconceived ideas or their feelings over facts.
Comfort zone, yeah.
They don't care what's in front of them, what logic, what evidence is in front of them.
Yeah.
If it doesn't conform with what they believe or what they want to be true, then they won't believe it. And they'll do everything in their power to make sure that they don't believe it,
Yeah,
even if the evidence is right in front of them.
Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna tell you what they'll do. They will stop talking to you. I have this happen to me all the time. They avoid me like the plague because they know what I'm gonna say is that's not true. They don't want to be around somebody who's gonna disrupt their beliefs with truth. I don't want to hear all that. I ain't coming here to hear no truth.
Some call it cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance, that's right.
So you turn that off in your brain like that's going to change something.
Yeah, whether you want to believe it or not, it's true. Like,
It's
that's
the
what it
truth.
is.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we got to do the book club now.